In this Part 7 presentation, I'll be talking about the management practices that would influence the uptake of calcium into apple fruit. In previous presentations, I've emphasized the importance of calcium to apple fruit quality. And when you grow apples, calcium deficiency can cause you significant yield losses. I was in the field collecting fruit samples a couple of weeks ago, and I found some very beautiful Honeycrisp apples, as well as some not so good looking ones. These are Honeycrisp apples, and they are notorious for developing a calcium deficiency disorders called the bitter pit, as you can see on the pictures on the right. If you were to send samples of good fruit and bitter pit fruit to the lab for mineral nutrient analysis, you find that these fruit have a very different nutrient profile. I'll be talking more about the lab results of this fruit in my Part 8 presentation. But for now, I'll be focusing on ways you can manage the crop so that calcium uptake into the fruit can be maximized. There are many crop management practices that can help you increase apple fruit calcium as well as marketable yield. Here's an example of a Honeycrisp apple orchard where the grower followed many of these practices. This orchard is only 3 years old, and this is its very first year of production. It is often a challenging task to get an orchard into production this quickly and still get good quality crop, seen here. But the grower was able to achieve his production goal because he strictly followed a comprehensive crop management program. Before we proceed, I believe it is very important to understand that there's very little to no correlations between the leaf and the fruit calcium in apples. What that means is that you can have high leaf calcium as well as high fruit calcium, or you can have very high leaf calcium but ending up with low calcium in the fruit. So if you're interested to see what your fruit calcium is doing, I would take the fruit samples and send them to the lab to be analyzed for mineral content of the fruit and pay less attention to the tissue calcium levels in your apple leaves. Now, for the rest of my presentation, I'll be talking about some of the management practices that can influence the calcium in your fruit. One of the ways to increase apple quality these days is to plant your trees in a high density planting, here as seen on the right, compared to the traditional low density planting. In the high density planting, you normally have a more narrow between row spacing and tighter within rows tree planting. In the low density planting, you may have 3, 4, maybe 500 trees per acre planted, compared to the newer high density planting where you may have 900, 1,000, or even more. I've seen as much as 2,000 to 3,000 plants per acre with this high density planting. The idea with high density is that you're planting more trees into it so you can get the trees to grow into production size sooner. So you would start taking out the fruit and start making money sooner. Another thing that happens with this high density planting is you have this dwarfing rootstocks. Dwarfing rootstocks will control the height and the vigor of the trees so that you have less leaves that are in the way of the fruit. This way, the fruits are more exposed to sunlight and giving it better color near harvest. Also, when you go through and spray the orchards with nutrients such as calcium, more of that nutrient sprays will end up on the fruit, and therefore you get more absorption. Another thing that happens when you control the vigor of the trees is that you have a lot less leaves. And as I mentioned in the previous presentation, the leaves can act as a competition for calcium from the fruit. So when you have less of the leaves and more of the fruit, then you get more calcium that ends up on the fruit. Crop load plays an important role to how much calcium ends up in the fruit. When you have a really high crop load, like in this picture here. The tree would have to take calcium up from the soil and then divide it up for all those fruit. So when you have really high crop load, you can end up with lower calcium content in the fruit. The university have determined that the branch can handle between 5 to 7 fruit per square centimeter of the branch diameter. So you can measure the branch diameter using this equilifruit disc. And once you have determined the diameter of that branch, then it will tell you how much fruit you should have on that branch, and you can thin off the one that are extras. Another research done by Dr. Lee Kalsitz from the Tree Fruit Research Center in Wenatchee, Washington, found that you can get up to 40% reduction in the wind under the shade structures. So when you have less wind under the structure, you also have less transpiration. When you have less transpiration, the calcium that comes up from the soil will end up more in the fruit and not so much in the leaves, which is a big benefit. If you are a grower of apples in Washington State and your trees are not under the shade structure, you likely would have to do something to help prevent sunburn damage on the fruit. And you're probably familiar with the use of calcium carbonate, which comes in many type of brands and products out there. Spraying calcium carbonate onto the trees will put on this white residues, which will help reflect sunlight and thereby reducing the surface temperature of the fruit and the leaves. Now, not all calcium carbonate products are created equal. At Yara, we have the Yara Vita Caltrac, which is a 23.8% calcium product. It is a formulated product with the right type of adjuvants to help with the absorption of those calcium into the fruit. It has a controlled particle size, which means that we have the particle size that are smaller, that are readily available and going into the fruit, as well as particle size that are slightly larger that will hang around longer for a slower absorption for an extended period of time. If you use Yara Vita Caltrac as your calcium source for the apples, it will also provide the benefits of this white residues that will protect you from sunburns onto the apples. And it will also improve your nitrogen to calcium ratios because of the higher calcium uptake into the fruit, and in turn, improve your fruit quality. When we talk about crop management, we also have to talk about soil nutrition. Most of the calcium that gets taken up into the crop comes from the soil, specifically from the soil solution. And I have talked about in more details about this slide in my previous presentation, but the essence of it is that you need calcium that's in the soil solution, but more specifically in this fertigated zone, which is usually the top 12 inches. Traditionally, in order to know exactly how much calcium is available, you would take soil tests, usually one in the spring before bud break and one in the fall, or post-harvest, sometime in September or October. Now, in more intensive calcium program, like in Honeycrisp apple, which has high value, you may also want to take soil sample in the middle of the season to see where you are at with the calcium level in the soil solution. And if your calcium level in the soil solution is low in the middle of the season, then knowing that from the results from the soil test, you can take action and add more calcium into the soil so that the crop will not run into a calcium deficiency problem. More recently, there's been a lot of talk in tree fruit about the soil health, specifically the soil biology. You can see in this picture here, you have the plant roots in the soil, pretty nice roots. And you have an area here where you have the roots that are interacting with the soil organisms that are helping to fix nutrients and putting them into the plant for uptake. Now, the use of microorganisms to help improve nutrient uptake into the plant is still being understudied. But More and more evidence is showing that the bacteria and fungi in the soil can help the plants take up nutrients and increase yield. If we look at this table, we can see that the typical soil organism numbers are by the millions, per grams of soil. We have bacteria, 100 million bacteria per gram of soil. Fungi, somewhat less, about 200,000 per grams of soil. We have protozoa, we have earthworm. And you can be sure that these organisms is affecting how the plants are taking up nutrients. Now, there are some bad bacteria, but there are also some good bacteria, as well as there are some bad fungi and there are good fungi. And knowing how to foster those good bacteria and fungi in the soil can actually improve your tree's nutrient uptake into the fruit. Here are some of the products that are available in the market. There are many, many products out there. But the point I'm trying to make here is that some products will be composed of mainly bacteria, and some products will be a mix between bacteria and fungi. Now, there's no guarantee that you will be successful at improving the nutrient uptake into your crop when you use these products, because there's a lot of variability in the soil type and the way this organism would thrive. These are inoculants. So you apply them to the soil in hoping that they would actually germinate and start growing and develop relationship with your plant roots. Now, if this organism don't thrive after you apply them to the soil, then you're basically wasting your money. Another point I like to make is that in the soil pH can affect your microorganisms. In the higher pH soil, for example, is dominated by bacteria, and lower pH soil usually is dominated more with the fungi. So when choosing the products to use on your soil, be mindful with that. And also, you might want to try a couple of different products to see which one works better as well. One way to help foster the soil organism is to do mulching. Mulching is a practice of putting some plant materials on top of the soil. Like in this picture here, we have what's called the mow-and-blow, where the grower would come in with a mower. He would mow this grassy area, or what's called drive rows, where there's a lot of grass, and he will open the side chute of the mower, so when the mower goes by, it shoots out all the grass into the area underneath the tree here. So you can see all this grass clippings that ended up underneath the tree. What that does is it will mulch that area. It will reduce the temperature of the soil in the summer, because as the sunshine comes beating down on those soil, it will heat up the soil surface, which can be bad for the roots. But when you have a lot of that plant materials on top of the soil, it will help temperate the temperatures of the soil. Another thing that mulching does is conserve soil moisture. You can see here, bare area under the tree, all this moisture will evaporate into the air and lost as gas, a lot more so than this area over here. And also, the soil microorganism would tend to prefer this type of environment where you have a lot of organic matter material covering on top of the soil, conserving moisture, also as well as temperating the temperature of the soil, will make the soil organism thrive better. So if you're into increasing your soil biology, this is one of the great ways to do that. Another thing that all this mulching will do is that it will add organic matter eventually over time into your soil, which is sometimes a good thing. For this sandy soil area in Washington, increasing soil organic matter means increasing nutrient holding capacity as well as water holding capacity, which can be a good thing. One maybe negative thing is that all this fresh plant material will take nitrogen to break down. So it can temporarily reduce the nitrogen content of your soil. But eventually, over time, those nitrogen will cycle back into the soil. Uh, and so one of the way you need to be mindful of is to take soil tests and make sure that the level of the nitrogen that's in your soil, because if this practice continues over time, you will certainly need to be using less nitrogen so your tree would not get too much of it. The way the water is delivered to the soil in an orchard can make an impact on how the trees take up calcium and other nutrients. Traditionally, orchardists would use this impact sprinkler. The impact sprinkler shoots out this big stream of water. That big stream of water will land hard onto the soil and causing it to compact over time. That compact soil or the hard packed soil makes it hard for the root to breathe or pick up nutrients from the soil. The new way of delivering water to the soil anymore in the orchard is the use of these micro sprinklers. These micro sprinklers are so gentle that when it lands onto the soil surface, it doesn't cause compaction, keeping the soil loose. Therefore, the nutrient uptake will be better because your roots will be much happier and getting better aeration and be able to move through the soil much easier. Another thing you have to be careful when you're watering the orchard is not to overwater. When you overwater, one of the problems that will happen is on this bare soil, you cause these ruts of runoff of the soil. When you have this runoff, you're losing soil, you're losing water, you also have nutrient surface runoff. For example, if you have a lot of phosphorus that you applied on the soil, the phosphorus, once applied to the soil, it does not move downward very much. It will tend to stay within a few inches of where you applied to the top of the soil. Now, when you have this runoff of soil from the surface, the soil will carry away with it phosphorus, causing problems that you may hear from the news from time to time when you have phosphorus contaminating riverways and causing algae bloom to occur and reducing the quality of the water in the riverways. And that's because of all the phosphorus that get washed off into the river. If you're careful and use the right kind of sprinklers or water delivering system, as well as the amount of watering, needs to be monitored very tightly. When you do all that well, you reduce the nutrient surface runoff, you improve the soil structure, and you will improve nutrient uptake into the fruit, including calcium. Here's a chart that I borrowed from FAO.org. It shows you the soil moisture monitoring graph. As the moisture goes up and down throughout the season, it can be monitored using soil probe installed to a certain depth in the soil. Now, this chart will help you determine when you need water and when you need to stop watering. It is very important to know when you need water and when to stop watering, because if you water too much, then you start getting a lot of water that moves down the soil profile, carrying away with it nutrients, a phenomenon called leaching. So a lot of the mobile nutrient like nitrate and sulfate would move readily through the soil profile and leach out. And when that happens, you lose nutrients. Also, when you overwater, as you can see here, the soil moisture is going up, passing the irrigation full line. When that happens, your soil is so wet and the air pores in the soil is reduced greatly. When you overwater a lot, not only that you lose a lot of nutrients through leaching, you can also run into root rot problems, which is a big problem with apples. Another thing you can use this information is to do what's called the water deficit program. The water deficit approach can be used to control tree vigor. so that when you have too much vigor in an orchard, there are some people that would use the way you water to try to control the vigor by running the orchard drier. And the use of this graph, this information will tell you how dry you can run the orchard and when to water again. Because obviously you don't want to run too dry that the tree will start dying, but you can run it dry enough that the tree will shut down and will not produce as many leaves and controlling your vigor. You can also use this water moisture chart to time the watering as you come nearer to harvest. As you come nearer to harvest, you might be wanting to back off on your watering to improve your fruit quality and such. And that can be done using the soil moisture monitoring. I'm borrowing this one. This particular chart was from grapes. It's the only one that I can find on the web that I like to talk about and make my point. There are many charts out there, especially if you're a grower and you have a soil moisture monitoring in your farm. You can definitely utilize this tool to help you determine how much to water, to conserve nutrients, to control tree growth, and to basically increase your watering efficiency as well. When we're on the subject of watering, one of the things that I like to point out is that using water, as you can see here, sprinklers on top of the orchard, this is done a lot to help cool the crop during the hot summer. This is called the overhead cooling. The use of this overhead cooling when it's really hot out can actually introduce too much water in your orchard. And when you have too much water in your orchard, again, you're leaching out a lot of nutrients out of the profile. You're leaching out nitrogen, sulfate, and also calcium. When calcium is in the soil solution and you're watering, you're flushing that calcium away, you end up with less calcium in soil solution for plant uptake. So anymore, the more progressive growers are using this shade cloth in their orchard. Shade cloth is very expensive structure to put up. Last time I checked, it was between $10,000 to $12,000 per acre to do something like this. But when you use this shade cloth, you eliminate the need of using this overhead cooling system. And sometimes if you still need that overhead cooling, some people will actually use fogging system or really fine misting system instead of using this stream of water. So that when you're using misting system, it will evaporate sooner, perhaps before it actually hits the ground. So it will provide you with the evaporate cooling, but not adding as much water into the ground. When you're using this shade cloth, it almost sometimes eliminates the need for this overhead cooling. But I've seen some growers who will go in and put in a line of a fogging line to help cool the crop even more. When you're cooling the crop with a shade system like this, you're reducing transpiration, so the leaves are losing less water. So when the calcium is taken up from the soil, instead of all going into the leaves, it actually going into the fruit a little bit more, and thereby increasing the calcium uptake into your fruit when you utilize this type of system. When you do overhead cooling, the more people I talk to, the more people shake their head and they're trying to get away from this type of system because the soil just stay too wet, the roots are rotting, the calcium is they're losing calcium, food quality is not good. There's a lot of problem associated with this type of system. So I've talked a lot about the transpiration and how important that is for the calcium uptake into the fruit. Obviously, in the middle of the season, you want less transpiration because most of the calcium will end up on the leaves and not the fruit. So there's been studies that have been done that would look at that, and you're welcome to visit these studies that looked at the transpiration rate, the fruit moisture, calcium concentration, all that stuff. But one of the good points that was made in these studies is that you have unfixed calcium that are in the fruit is concentrated in the water solution of the fruit. Now, those unfixed calcium has not become a part of the cell wall. So when there's a reversal of the xylem flow from the fruit, you actually get a net loss of calcium from the fruit. So the moisture from the fruit can sometimes get drawn back out into the leaves and taking with it calcium. So the leaves can actually take calcium away from the fruit. So it is very important to manage your tree vigor and your watering practice so that less of that outward movement of the calcium from the fruit into the leaves is minimized. I've talked about root rot problem in apples, and here's a couple of pictures that I've taken recently. Here we have the crown rot in apples, and we have what's called the crown gall. This crown gall is caused by a tumor-causing bacteria. Now, anytime you have a death of the tissues around the tree trunk or any type of gall that's restricting the nutrient flow upward into the plant, then you have an effect on the nutrient uptake. This crown rot can be caused by overwatering. It can be caused by, because you have the pathogen present that were able to get into the wounds of the plants. And overwatering situation definitely does not help with this crown rot. Then we have this crown gall that is very prevalent in Washington State. And the way that you manage crown gall is to make sure that you have a clean nursery stock, that when you're planting the trees, you're not causing any wounds. And there are many other management practices that you can do to help with this, and perhaps the use of some chemicals as well. But be very mindful that when your tree is affected by some disease, the nutrient uptake can be affected. The calcium uptake will be definitely affected as well. Lastly, water quality is very important. When you irrigate your crop, you want to make sure that you have the best possible water to use. In this picture here, I took of this young tree being irrigated with the drip irrigation. You can see that this irrigation water has something in it, because when you drip irrigate and all the water that moves to the edge and dries, it accumulated this white residue or substance on the edge of this irrigated zone. This white stuff can be either the sodium or the bicarbonate in the water that over time, as it accumulates, it can cause this crusting on the soil surface. Now, more and more of this accumulation is not good for the rooting environment. And if your soil is not conducive for good root growth, you are going to limit the uptake of the nutrients, including calcium, into the fruit. There are many ways to fix your water quality, including the use of water treatment system. But at the end, you want to make sure that you have good quality water to irrigate your crop with. Thank you for watching this part 7 of 8 parts video series I'm making about apple calcium nutrition. Please stay tuned for my next presentation, where I'll be talking about the fruit mineral analysis of apples as well as some soil test results. Thank you. Goodbye.